Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Good morning. Yesterday I completed my first half term as a qualified teacher. I survived. I'll talk more about that towards the end of the episode. First, I wanted to talk about teacher training. Over the past 2 or 3 weeks, I seem to have attended lots of teacher training, and these sessions have given rise to several interesting questions which I'd like to share with you. As an early career teacher, I am enrolled on the Early Career Teacher Programme, which is a programme of training that takes place over the course of 2 years. And I went along to my first in-person session a couple of weeks ago. Now, this session proceeded in much the same fashion as many of the sessions I attended as a PGCE student last year, so when I was a trainee teacher. So what happens is there is a topic, or several topics on the agenda. At this session a couple of weeks ago, the topic was motivation, in particular, extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So what happens is we are given the topic, we are asked to discuss the topic with the people around us on our tables. We do that for 10-15 minutes, and then we come back together as a big group, and one person from each table feeds back to the rest of the group and reports their findings, and those findings are welcomed and celebrated and discussed by the session lead, and indeed by other people who are attending the session. Now, I think this approach is lacking in several respects. I would like to stress at the start that this opinion is mine, and maybe mine alone. And I may have missed something, got on the wrong end of the stick, I don't know. But I'm going to throw it out there anyway, in the hopes that it might spark some discussion. So, like I said, I feel that this approach is lacking for several reasons. The first one is take the topic of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. Countless books have been written on that topic. People have devoted their entire lives to researching those ideas. There is lots of knowledge out there. And when I say knowledge, it really is as good as we can get. Okay? Short of mathematical knowledge, because arguably mathematical knowledge is the most solid type of knowledge you can have. But short of that, you've got scientific knowledge. So there's loads of knowledge out there on this topic. It's empirically grounded, backed up by the science. It's been replicated again and again in countless studies. There's loads of stuff out there, yet we didn't touch on any of it. Instead, as I said, we were asked to discuss the topic with the people around us. And much of the discussion was interesting, but it was largely anecdotal. Some of it was contradictory. Some people didn't seem to appreciate the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which isn't their fault because we weren't told it. And I guess this leads me to what I consider to be another issue with this approach. When you have a mix of different opinions on a topic, some more informed than others, some contradictory, most of them based on anecdotal evidence alone, that discussion becomes quite hostile to the facts, if that's what you want to call them, or to the knowledge. I say this because I happen to do 2 of my essays as a PGCE student on the topic of motivation, in particular on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So this was a bit of a coincidence. I was sat there thinking, oh great, this is going to build on the stuff that I learnt as a PGCE student. But like I said, we didn't actually discuss any of the research. Instead, we had these anecdotal conversations, and I was reluctant to discuss any of the research that I had done on the topic of motivation, because I knew that it would undermine and contradict some of the opinions that were being shared. And so I didn't discuss any of my research because I didn't want to alienate anyone at the table. It would have been unfair on them. But I feel that this situation could have been avoided if we were first told something about the topic, introduced to the research, if we had been taught something about motivation before we were allowed to go away and have our discussions. That would have given our discussions a bit more structure. I mean, I can see that they're trying to take a guided discovery approach to this teacher training, which can be a good approach. But I feel that sometimes we need more guidance. We need a little bit more information at the start so that our discussions can be better informed. I did discuss this with a colleague, and he pointed out as well that if we aren't really being given anything by way of knowledge or instruction and just told to have our own discussions on the topic, then that suggests that we already have all the answers. In which case, what was the point of the training session? So you can see that I have my reservations when it comes to this approach to teacher training. In fact, it would be to teaching in general. I'd never try to teach my students anything in that way. I wouldn't just give them a topic that they may have never heard of and ask them to discuss it amongst themselves and then feed back to the group and then celebrate what they feed back as knowledge. I wouldn't do that as a teacher. And so I just find it a bit bemusing when that is the approach taken in teacher training. Wow, this has turned into a bit of a moan. I didn't mean it to be so moany, but I think it raises an important issue. And if you have any thoughts on it, please let me know. And I should also say that I'm discussing it here on the podcast because I think it is worth discussing, but I also have given feedback on the session itself to the session moderators, and they can decide whether they think my feedback is worth acting on. So I guess that was a comment on the way these sessions are run. I'd now like to raise a specific question about the content, some of the content of that session. Throughout that session and throughout much of my training as a PGCE student last year, we were told again and again that every child is unique. Every child is unique. But then, also in that session a couple of weeks ago, we were told that as a teacher you must always be fair, and being fair means being consistent, and you can't make exceptions of any students. And so my question is, how do you reconcile that with the idea that every child is unique? Because if every child is unique, surely we should make an exception of each and every child because they're all different. And we couldn't take a consistent approach because we would need to address the needs of each and every child, which would all be different because they're all unique. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. And I'm not saying it's an actual contradiction, I'm just saying there seems to be one. And I worry that for new trainees, this was certainly the case for me. The first time they hear that every child is unique, that may make them worry that if they have a class of 30 students, they need to plan 30 different lessons. And surely that isn't what is expected of them. That isn't what we mean when we say every child is unique. But if that's not what we mean, what do we mean? So how is the claim that every child is unique relevant to education? Because it certainly is, but how does that play out in practice? Certainly every child is unique, in the same way that every person is unique. No one is no one else. Did that make sense? No one is no one else. No one is anyone else. But I think it would be helpful to caveat that statement with the fact that while every child is unique, most children learn in the same sorts of ways. And that has to be true. If it isn't, then we might as well give up the whole idea of classroom teaching. And we should try to teach every single child on an individual one-to-one basis, which wouldn't be practical. So the underlying premise of classroom teaching is that most children learn in the same sorts of ways. And if you teach in those sorts of ways to a class of children, then most of the children in that class, if not all of them, will learn. I think that would put a lot of trainee teachers' minds to rest. So those first two questions arose for me when I was at the ECT session, but I've been to a few other training sessions since then. One was a Colourworks session with my school. Colourworks provide personality profiles. So before the session, I had to answer 30 or so questions. Each question would give me 4 options, and I had to pick the option that I thought most described myself, the option that I thought least described myself, and then I had to rank the remaining 2. Based on your answers to these questions, Colourworks generate a personality profile, and it is thorough. We were each given a 20-page booklet telling us all about us, and some of it was spookily accurate. And it's called Colourworks because each of the different personality types is given a colour. So it turns out that I'm a blue. I'm predominantly a blue, which means I'm an observer. In particular, I am a coordinating observer. So these colours, you've got red is a director, orange is a motivator, yellow is an inspirer, light green is a helper, darker green is a supporter, greeny blue is a coordinator, blue is an observer, and purple is a reformer. So reds are typically competitive, demanding, determined, strong-willed, and purposeful. But on a bad day, they can be domineering, controlling, abrupt, and rude. Yellows are sociable, dynamic, demonstrative, enthusiastic, and persuasive, but on a bad day, they can be frantic, random, indiscreet, and hasty. Greens are typically caring, encouraging, sharing, patient, and relaxed. But on a bad day, they can be slow, stubborn, reliant, and compliant. Blues, and this is me apparently, are typically cautious, precise, deliberate, questioning, and formal, but on a bad day they can be cynical, indecisive, aloof, and pedantic. That seems fairly accurate in my case. But the personality profiles went much deeper than that. They discussed personality styles, interacting with others, decision-making, key strengths and weaknesses, the value brought to the team, effective communications, barriers to effective communication, possible blind spots, your opposite type, suggestions for development, and management. So it's a personality profile where each personality type is assigned a colour, but it's geared specifically towards professional development. Or at least that's what Colourworks says. My head teacher, he says that more than anything, it's a language. So some of these things can be difficult to talk about. Not emotionally difficult, but perhaps we just don't have the required vocabulary to have meaningful discussions. And Colourworks gives us that vocabulary. And I agree, I think that's incredibly useful. When I first arrived at my school, I often heard colleagues talking about themselves and others in terms of these different colours, and the discussion seemed to be very constructive. So I agree, it does seem to be useful. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? There's always a but. I think I have two issues with this sort of thing, and perhaps they're issues with personality profiling in general. The first one is that it assumes that you know yourself, that our self-concept, our concept of ourself, aligns with our actual selves. In other words, it assumes that what we believe about ourselves is actually true. And I'm not sure that that assumption stands up to scrutiny. I think often our friends and family, our close friends and family, know us better than we know ourselves. And this is partly because they can see us. By contrast, I'm on the inside looking out. I can't always see the look on my face. In fact, I can never see the look on my face unless I happen to be standing in front of a mirror. Those around me, however, can see me. And so I think it's correct to say that at least sometimes, but maybe a lot of the time, our nearest and dearest know us much better than we know ourselves. And the idea that we do know ourselves best has been the subject of academic scrutiny. I know I think it was in my final year as an undergraduate, I read a paper by Eric Schwitzgebel called The Unreliability of Naive Introspection, in which he basically argued that introspection, or naive introspection anyway, doesn't reveal a great deal. And what it does reveal can often be mistaken or misguided. He makes a point of saying naive introspection because he believes that if you're a trained or an expert introspector, then you have a better chance of finding the truth, or at least something closer to the truth. So that's one issue I have with these sorts of personality profiling services. They do assume that we know ourselves, and I don't think that's a well-founded assumption. The second one is stereotype threat. So, take computer science as an example. Girls do just as well, if not better than boys, in computer science at school. And yet very few girls choose computer science as a career path. Why is that? Well, the explanation is no doubt very complicated, but part of the explanation may be because they are conforming to the stereotype that girls don't choose those sorts of careers. Those sorts of careers are chosen by boys. That's the stereotype, and they conform to it. You see something similar in maths, with maths anxiety. So girls do at least as well, if not better than boys, in maths, yet it's overwhelmingly girls who suffer with maths anxiety. Again, that may be because they're conforming to the stereotype that girls and maths are somehow incompatible. It's boys who do maths. It's boys who do computer science. So bringing this back to personality profiling, I didn't know what personality type I was. Now I do. Apparently I'm a blue. Also, all my colleagues know that I'm a blue. And I worry now that I will conform to that stereotype. I may find myself being more blue than I was before. Or perhaps, for fear of conforming to the stereotype, I may go in the opposite direction. I may end up becoming more yellow. Sociable, dynamic, demonstrative, enthusiastic, persuasive. Or on a bad day, frantic, random, indiscreet, and hasty. But either way, knowledge of my personality type may end up affecting my personality type, which I'm not sure I'd welcome. Okay, so I've spoken about 2 training sessions. Now there was one more that I attended. It was a session on memory and retention with Ross Morrison McGill. and he is the teacher toolkit person. He's very famous in the world of teaching, apparently. I'm not denying that he's famous, but I'm fairly new to the world of teaching, so I hadn't yet heard of him. But it was a fantastic session, and in contrast to the ECT session I'd had a week or so before, I left this session feeling like I'd been taught something. So normally I'm the teacher in the room, teaching students, but at this session, I was the student. I was learning. Ross McGill was teaching me stuff about memory and retention, and I left knowing more than I did when I arrived. It was good. It was a great session. He said one thing in particular, though, that I'd like to reflect on. He said that if you understand how the brain works, then that could make you a better teacher. This was his belief, and of course that's the underlying premise of the whole session. We were there to learn about how the brain worked, with the hope that it might improve our practice as teachers. So that was the underlying premise. And he drew an analogy with a mechanic race car driver. So he said that having an understanding of how the engine works would make you a better race car driver. I'm not so sure. I feel that truly expert teaching is a transparent experience. Now, I'm using the language of a philosopher called Martin Heidegger here. Take the example of an expert carpenter, say, hammering away at nails. He doesn't need to pay attention to the hammer, nor the nails. He's just hammering. It's a transparent experience. The experience would cease being transparent, however, if something went wrong, if the hammer suddenly broke, say, and he would suddenly have to pay attention because he has a problem to solve, needs to fix the hammer or find a new one, whatever it might be. The experience is no longer transparent. Returning to teaching, I think that being an expert teacher would be similarly transparent. It's something you do without attending to the fact that you're doing it. It's second nature or instinct. And I wonder if learning about cognitive science, how the brain works, how the mind works, how we learn, would make the experience of teaching less transparent. Go back to the carpenter. If he had just had a 3-hour-long professional development session on how hammers work, I would guess that the next time he hammered, his experience wouldn't be so transparent, because he'd be thinking about aspects of the hammer, thinking about what he learnt. Similarly, after a 3-hour session on memory and retention, next time I teach, I may be thinking about memory and retention as I'm teaching, and so my experience of teaching may become a little bit obscured. It's no longer as transparent. I'd say that it's this sort of sentiment that may fuel the opposition to research that I've seen within teaching. There's teaching practice, and then there's educational research, and a lot of teachers seem to be opposed to educational research. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that it gives them more to think about, when they would rather be having a transparent teaching experience with their students. I don't know, just throwing it out there. I feel like this has very much been a throwing it out there episode, actually. So if you have an opinion on anything that I've thrown towards you, please do get in touch and let me know. Now, as I said at the start of this episode, yesterday I finished my first half term as a qualified teacher, and I'd say it's gone quite well, and my head of department also seems to be pleased, which is great. One of the highlights so far came yesterday when I marked my 10 beta assessment papers. So 10 beta are the bottom set in year 10, and they're not on the same curriculum as the rest of the students in year 10. They're on a more foundational curriculum that's designed to shore up the basics with a view to getting them, hopefully, a 2 in GCSE maths. So suffice to say, they're kids who struggle with the subject, at least compared to their peers. But they're wonderful, wonderful kids. And in that class, there's actually a fair amount of enthusiasm for the subject, which is really encouraging. But anyway, yesterday I marked their most recent test papers, and they did really well. And a couple of them got into the 90%. And a win with these kids just feels so much bigger than a win with any of my other classes. Take my top set year 9s, for instance. They're doing some pretty hard maths, and most of them get well into the 80% on their unit assessments. And I always have a good handful getting 100%, which is great. That always makes me happy. But there's something about getting these beta kids, who are right at the bottom in terms of sets. When they do well, it just means so much more. And to end on a funny note, one of the reasons some of the kids in my beta class are in that class is because English is a second language. And some of them do struggle with their language. And you can sometimes see that they're getting the wrong answer, not because they don't know how to do it, but they don't understand the question. And this is true for one of my students in particular. But she recently has been accompanied by an interpreter for at least one of the lessons I have a week. So an interpreter sits with her and helps her understand what I'm saying, helps her understand the question, and it's been fantastic. I mean, this student has never lacked enthusiasm for the subject. She really wants to do well, but now she can really access it as well, and she's making leaps and bounds. I think she got 69% on the most recent unit assessment, which is a massive personal best for her. At least as long as I've known her, she'll be delighted. I can't wait to tell her. But anyway, she has this interpreter who sits next to her, and I now have to be very careful with my shushs. So as a teacher, I often find myself shushing my class just to bring the volume level down to where I'd like it. But with an interpreter in the classroom, I keep finding myself shushing the interpreter. I'll be demonstrating something on the board, hear some discussion, shush the class. The discussion may continue, and I turn round with my teacher face on, which is somewhere between looking angry, surprised, and disappointed. It's in that area. I whip round to the class with that look on my face, only to find that it's the poor interpreter who I've been shushing. The rest of the kids are silent. And of course I apologise to the interpreter and ask her to continue. But even so, it's tricky. When I've got someone talking in the classroom, it can be tricky to distinguish who it is who's doing the talking, especially if I'm not facing the classroom. So if you've had any experience of this, then please let me know how you found it. Okay, regarding mental health, there is very little to report. I feel tired, and at times quite stressed. But I'd say my mental health has never been more robust. At least not since my downfall. So at least not since when I first started struggling with mental health issues. I now realise that for many years I was trying to avoid stress, and that was the wrong way to go about it. I should instead have been looking for meaningful stress, and I feel that in teaching that's what I've found. To put it another way, I've found a purpose. And it's a purpose that is your best defence against mental health problems. That at least has been my experience so far. I hope that your experience has been the same. Now, this episode took 2 to 3 hours to produce, and I typically produce 2 to 3 episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, £2 to £3, then please consider becoming a patron and making a monthly contribution towards covering the costs of producing the podcast, which are around £14 per month. Any contribution would be greatly appreciated. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.